In the summer of 60 AD, a Roman soldier stationed in Britain stood on the walls of a settlement called Camulodunum and watched the horizon with growing terror. For days now, refugees had been streaming into the city with horrifying stories. A massive army was coming. An army of Celtic warriors, tens of thousands strong, led by a woman who had sworn to drive every Roman from British soil. And when this soldier squinted into the distance, he could finally see them. A dark mass stretching across the landscape as far as the eye could see. Warriors on foot, warriors on horseback, and chariots. So many chariots. And standing at the front of this enormous horde was the woman herself. She was impossibly tall with a mane of reddish gold hair that fell all the way down to her hips. Around her neck hung a massive golden torque. And even from this distance, the soldier could see that her eyes burned with a hatred that made his blood run cold. Her name was Boudica. And before this was over, she would burn 3 Roman cities to the ground and kill somewhere between 70,000 and 80,000 people in one of the bloodiest uprisings the Roman Empire had ever faced. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of historical mysteries and incredible true stories from history, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. In the year 43 AD, 17 years before Boudica's rebellion, the Roman Emperor Claudius ordered the invasion of Britain. Now, the Romans had actually attempted to conquer this mysterious island before. Julius Caesar himself had tried twice in 55 and 54 BC, but both times he had been forced to withdraw due to storms, supply problems, and fierce resistance from the local Celtic tribes. But Claudius was determined to succeed where Caesar had failed. And so he sent 4 Roman legions across the English Channel, with orders to subjugate the island once and for all. And subjugate it they did. Within just a few years, the Romans had conquered most of southern Britain. Some tribes fought back ferociously and were crushed. Others, recognizing that resistance was futile, chose to cooperate with their new overlords. One of these cooperative tribes was the Iceni, a powerful Celtic people who lived in what is now the county of Norfolk in eastern England. The Iceni were led by a king named Prasutagus, and he made a calculated decision. Rather than fight the Romans and risk annihilation, he would become what was known as a client king. This basically meant that as long as Prasutagus did Rome's bidding when asked, he could maintain some level of sovereignty within the Roman Empire. He could keep his throne, his lands, and his people could continue their way of life relatively undisturbed. It was a compromise, certainly, but Prasutagus believed it was the best way to protect his people. And for about 17 years, this arrangement worked. The Iceni paid their taxes to Rome, provided soldiers when requested, and in return, they were left largely alone. Prasutagus grew wealthy from trade with the Romans. He minted his own coins, a sign of his elevated status. And somewhere during this time, he married a woman named Boudica. Now, we know almost nothing about Boudica's early life. The Roman historian Tacitus tells us she was of royal descent, which suggests she came from a noble Celtic family, possibly from the Iceni tribe itself, or perhaps from another powerful tribe. What we do know is that she and Prasutagus had 2 daughters together, and by all accounts, they lived comfortably as the royal family of a client kingdom on the edge of the Roman Empire. But in the year 60 AD, everything changed. King Prasutagus died. Now, before his death, Prasutagus had done something that he believed would protect his family and his kingdom. He had written a will. In this will, he left half of his personal wealth and his kingdom to his 2 daughters. The other half he left to the Roman Emperor Nero. This was actually a common practice among client kings. By including the emperor in your will, you were essentially bribing Rome to leave your heirs alone. Prasutagus was betting that if Nero received a generous share of the Iceni wealth, he would honor the arrangement and allow Prasutagus's daughters to inherit the kingdom. It was a reasonable bet, but Prasutagus was wrong. When news of the king's death reached the Roman administrators in Britain, they saw an opportunity. The procurator of Britain, a man named Catus Decianus, was notorious for his greed. He looked at the wealthy Iceni kingdom and decided that half was not enough. Why settle for half when you could have everything? And so, Catus Decianus dispatched Roman soldiers to Iceni territory. They came not to honor Prasutagus' will, but to seize everything. The Romans announced that the Iceni kingdom was being annexed. All of Prasutagus' property now belonged to Rome. The lands and estates of leading Iceni nobles were confiscated. The Iceni people, who had been free allies of Rome for nearly 2 decades, were suddenly stripped of their status and reduced to the level of slaves. But the Romans were not finished. There was still the matter of Boudica herself. According to the Roman historian Tacitus, whose father-in-law actually served in Britain during this period and may have been an eyewitness to some of these events, what happened next was beyond barbaric. When Boudica protested the seizure of her husband's kingdom, when she demanded that the Romans honor Prasutagus' will, the Romans responded with unimaginable cruelty. They publicly flogged the queen. They stripped her naked and beat her in front of her own people. And her 2 daughters, who were likely still teenagers, were violated by Roman soldiers. This was not just an act of conquest. This was deliberate humiliation. This was Rome sending a message to every Briton watching. You are nothing. Your kings are nothing. Your queens are nothing. You belong to us now, body and soul. But if the Romans thought that publicly brutalizing the Iceni royal family would break the spirits of the British people, they had made a catastrophic miscalculation. Because Boudica was not broken. She was enraged. In the weeks following her humiliation, Boudica did something the Romans never expected. She began reaching out to other British tribes. She sent messengers to the Trinovantes, a neighboring tribe to the south who had their own reasons to hate the Romans. When the Romans had first conquered Britain, they had taken the Trinovantes tribal capital, a place called Camulodunum, and turned it into a Roman colony. Roman army veterans were given Trinovantes' land. The native people were forced out of their homes and treated, according to Tacitus, like slaves and prisoners. And to add insult to injury, the Romans had built an enormous temple there, dedicated to the Emperor Claudius, and the Britons were forced to pay for its construction and maintenance. So when Boudica's messengers arrived, asking the Trinovantes to join a rebellion, the answer was immediate and enthusiastic. Yes, other tribes soon followed. The hatred of Roman rule, which had been simmering beneath the surface for years, was finally boiling over. Within weeks, Boudica had assembled an army. The Roman historian Cassius Dio, writing about a century after these events, claims that Boudica's army numbered around 120,000 warriors. Now, this number is almost certainly exaggerated. Ancient historians routinely inflated the numbers of enemy forces to make Roman victories seem more impressive. But even if the real number was half that, or even a quarter, this was still an enormous force. And they were angry, they were armed, and they were ready to fight. Cassius Dio left us the only physical description we have of Boudica, and it paints a remarkable picture. He wrote that she was very tall, with a terrifying appearance and a fierce gaze. Her voice was harsh. A great mass of tawny reddish hair fell all the way to her hips. Around her neck, she wore a large golden torque, the traditional symbol of Celtic royalty. She dressed in a tunic of many colors, with a thick cloak fastened by a brooch. Now, standing before her assembled army, Boudica is said to have given a rousing speech. According to the Romans who recorded it, she told her warriors that she was not fighting as a queen descended from noble ancestors. She was fighting as an ordinary woman, avenging her lost freedom, her beaten body, and the violated honor of her daughters. She declared that this was a woman's resolve. As for the men, they could live as slaves if they wished. The first target was obvious: Camulodunum, the Roman colony built on Trinovantes' land, the city with the hated temple of Claudius. Now, here is where timing became crucial. At this exact moment, the Roman governor of Britain, a general named Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, was not in the eastern part of the province where Boudica was gathering her forces. He was hundreds of miles away on the far western coast of Britain, on an island called Mona, which is modern-day Anglesey in Wales. Mona was the last stronghold of the Druids, the Celtic priest class. The Romans considered the Druids to be a dangerous source of resistance, and Suetonius had taken a large portion of the Roman military forces in Britain to crush them once and for all. He had just completed his campaign when messengers arrived with devastating news. The eastern part of the province was in flames. The Iceni had risen, and a massive army was marching on Camulodunum. But before Suetonius could even begin the long march back east, Boudica's army had already arrived at the Roman colony, and the situation inside Camulodunum was desperate. The city had virtually no defenses. When the Romans had built it, they had focused on constructing amenities like theatres and bathhouses rather than walls. The population consisted largely of retired Roman soldiers and their families, merchants, administrators, and some Britons who had adopted Roman ways. When they learned that an army of enraged Celts was approaching, panic set in. The colonists sent urgent messages to Catus Decianus, the procurator whose greed had sparked this whole catastrophe, begging for reinforcements. Catus Decianus responded by sending 200 lightly armed soldiers, 200 men to face an army of tens of thousands. It was a death sentence. Meanwhile, strange omens were reportedly occurring throughout the city. The Statue of Victory in the city centre was said to have toppled over as if fleeing an enemy. Women possessed by some kind of frenzy were crying out that destruction was at hand. People claimed to have heard wailing in the theatre and foreign cries in the Senate House. The sea appeared blood red, and at low tide, shapes resembling human corpses were said to have been left on the shore. Whether these omens were real or invented later by Roman historians seeking to add drama to the story, we cannot know. What we do know is that when Boudica's army finally appeared on the horizon, the people of Camulodunum knew they were doomed. The battle, if you could call it that, was not much of a contest. Boudica's forces swept into the city like a wave. The 200 soldiers sent by Catus Decianus were overwhelmed almost immediately. The colonists who could not escape fled to the only fortified structure in the city, the Temple of Claudius. For 2 days, the survivors huddled inside the temple while Boudica's army systematically destroyed everything around them. They could hear the sounds of the city being torn apart, the crackling of flames, the screams. And then, on the 3rd day, the temple fell. Everyone inside was killed. The entire city was burned to the ground. To this day, archaeologists digging beneath the modern city of Colchester find a thick layer of red, burned debris from Boudica's destruction. Broken pottery, melted glass, charred timbers. It is called the Boudican destruction layer, and it tells the story of the city's complete annihilation. But Boudica was not finished, not even close. When news of the uprising reached Suetonius, he immediately began the long march east. Meanwhile, the commander of the 9th Legion, a general named Quintus Petilius Cerealis, decided to take matters into his own hands. He gathered what forces he could and marched to intercept Boudica's army. It was a disaster. Boudica's forces ambushed the 9th Legion and virtually destroyed it. The infantry was massacred. Cerealis himself only escaped with his cavalry by fleeing the battlefield at full speed. The 9th Legion, one of Rome's elite fighting forces, had been shattered. When Suetonius finally reached the area, he made a cold calculation. He rode ahead with his cavalry to the settlement of Londinium, which is modern-day London. At this point, Londinium was not yet the capital of Roman Britain, but it was a thriving commercial centre with a population of merchants, traders, and Roman officials. Suetonius assessed the situation and made a brutal decision. He could not defend the city. His forces were too few, and so he would abandon it. Tacitus describes the scene with chilling matter-of-factness. Suetonius announced that he was leaving. Anyone who could travel with his army was welcome to join. Anyone who could not, whether due to age, illness, or simply an attachment to their home, would be left behind. Many chose to stay. Perhaps they could not believe the Romans would truly abandon them. Perhaps they were too old or too weak to flee. Perhaps they simply refused to leave everything they had built. They would all die. Boudica's army descended on Londinium like a storm. The city was put to the torch. The inhabitants who had remained were hunted down and killed. According to the Roman sources, the Britons had no interest in taking prisoners or selling captives as slaves. They wanted blood. They wanted revenge. Tacitus writes that the Britons rushed to slaughter, hang, burn, and crucify with a kind of savage joy, as though they knew that punishment was coming and were determined to exact as much vengeance as possible before it arrived. Archaeologists have found evidence of Londinium's destruction throughout central London. A thick red layer of burned debris, similar to the one found in Colchester, lies buried beneath the modern streets. In 2013, Roman-era skulls were found in the ancient Walbrook stream, which some archaeologists believe may have been victims of Boudica's forces. During excavations, caches of personal items have been discovered, jewelry and valuables that appear to have been hastily buried by people hoping to survive and return for them later. They never did. The fires that consumed Londinium were so intense that they melted everything in their path. The burned remains form a layer, in some places up to 10 inches thick. After Londinium, Boudica turned her army toward a third target, Verulamium, the modern city of St. Albans. Verulamium was different from the first two cities. It was not a Roman colony like Camulodunum. It was a municipium, a free town inhabited mainly by Britons who had allied themselves with Rome, adopted Roman customs, and grown wealthy from cooperation with the empire. In Boudica's eyes, these people were traitors. Britons who had sold out their own people for Roman gold. They would receive no mercy. Suetonius had offered the people of Verulamium safe passage with his army. Many accepted, many did not. Those who remained met the same fate as the people of Londinium and Camulodunum. When the destruction was complete, 3 Roman cities lay in ruins. According to the ancient sources, somewhere between 70,000 and 80,000 Romans and Roman allied Britons had been killed. Modern historians believe this number may be exaggerated, but even if the true death toll was half that figure, it would still represent one of the worst disasters in the history of the Roman Empire. And Boudica was still undefeated. But now, finally, Suetonius was ready to fight. He had used the time during Boudica's rampage to gather his forces. He assembled the 14th Legion, parts of the 20th Legion, and whatever auxiliary troops he could summon. In total, he had perhaps 10,000 men. Boudica's army, swollen with new recruits eager to join the winning side, may have numbered well over 100,000. Suetonius was outnumbered by at least 10 to 1. But he was a veteran general, and he knew that in warfare, numbers were not everything. Location mattered, discipline mattered, and the Romans had both. Suetonius chose his battlefield carefully. He found a position at the end of a narrow defile with a forest at his back and woods protecting his flanks. The Britons would have to attack him head-on through a bottleneck that would neutralize their numerical advantage. On the day of the battle, Boudica rode in her chariot before her army, her daughters beside her. According to Tacitus, she told her warriors that the Romans had nowhere left to run. Win today, and the foreigners would be driven from Britain forever. Lose, and they could expect only chains and slavery. Her warriors cheered. They were so confident of victory that they had brought their families with them to watch. Wagons loaded with women, children, and elderly spectators were positioned in a great ring behind the army. They would have a front row seat to watch the Romans be destroyed. It was a decision that would doom them. When the battle began, Boudica's army surged forward across the open ground toward the Roman lines. They came in a huge, disorganized mass, screaming war cries, blowing their carnixes, the distinctive Celtic war trumpets. They expected to overwhelm the Romans with sheer numbers. But as they advanced, they were funneled into the narrow ground Suetonius had chosen. They could not spread out. They could not use their numbers. They were packed together so tightly that they could barely swing their weapons. And then the Romans attacked. The legionaries, highly trained soldiers who had drilled for exactly this kind of close-quarters combat, moved forward in a wedge formation. They threw their javelins first, 2 volleys that tore through the packed British ranks. Then they drew their short swords and advanced in disciplined silence. The British warriors, brave as they were, could not stand against the Roman military machine. They began to fall back, and then they began to run. But when they tried to flee, they discovered the trap they had made for themselves. Those wagons full of spectators that they had positioned behind their army, they were now blocking the only escape route. The fleeing warriors slammed into the wall of their own wagons and became hopelessly entangled. The Romans advanced methodically, killing everything in their path. They gave no quarter. They killed the warriors. They killed the women and children in the wagons. They even killed the animals. By the time the slaughter ended, the battlefield was carpeted with corpses. Roman sources claim that 80,000 Britons died that day, while Roman losses were only 400. These numbers are almost certainly propaganda, but there is no doubt that the British defeat was total and catastrophic. As for Boudica, she disappeared from the battlefield. According to Tacitus, she escaped the carnage and later took poison to avoid capture. Cassius Dio claims she fell ill and died. Either way, she was gone. Her rebellion died with her. In the aftermath, Suetonius conducted brutal reprisals against the British tribes. Villages were burned, leaders were executed, land was confiscated. The Roman Empire would maintain control of Britain for another 350 years. But Boudica was never forgotten. Her story was preserved by the very Romans who had crushed her rebellion. Tacitus and Cassius Dio, writing for Roman audiences, presented her as a formidable adversary, a woman who had nearly driven the mightiest empire in the world out of Britain. Centuries later, when the British themselves built an empire that spanned the globe, they looked back at Boudica not as a defeated enemy, but as a national hero, a symbol of British courage and resistance. Today, a bronze statue of Boudica stands near Westminster Bridge in London, not far from the Houses of Parliament. She is depicted riding her chariot, spear in hand, her daughters beside her, forever charging into battle against impossible odds. The irony is not lost on historians. The statue stands in a city that Boudica herself burned to the ground. The same Britons who once cheered her rebellion later became heirs to the Roman legacy she had fought to destroy. And when they built their own empire, they did so using many of the same methods and justifications as the Romans. But none of that diminishes what Boudica accomplished. A woman who had been publicly humiliated, whose daughters had been violated, who had every reason to simply accept her fate, instead chose to fight back. She raised an army, destroyed 3 cities, killed tens of thousands, and came within a single battle of changing the course of history. Her name meant victory. And even though she lost her final battle, in some ways, she won something greater. She won immortality. Nearly 2,000 years later, we still remember her name. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed today's story, please let me know in the comments what other historical figures you'd like to learn about. And remember, we have a whole playlist of incredible true stories from history ready for you to watch right now. So click here and keep exploring. Until next time.